Crisis on Infinite Earths. This is by far one of the most popular and important comic storylines we've ever had. And they've actually adapted this a few times in media. They did it in the CW, but they also did it in a three-part movie trilogy in the Tomorrowverse. Now, the reason this is such an iconic storyline and so important, this story is often used to reboot the entire DC universe, and it is a culmination of a bunch of universes all colliding, all coming together. So obviously, anytime that you are going to undertake that type of storyline, whether it is in a TV show or in a movie, it is an extremely difficult and important task. And because it is such an iconic and important storyline in the comics, it is also going to be subject to a tremendous amount of ridicule. And that is why I decided that the next entry in the Overrated or Overhated series that I have been doing on this channel will indeed be Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, I'm not doing it just based on one of the movies. I am doing it based on the entire trilogy, because that is one through-line storyline. Again, I will be doing that similar for Batman Long Halloween Part 1 and 2. I will do that as one video because to me, that is telling one congruent story altogether. But that being said, today we are talking Crisis on Infinite Earths. Overrated or overhated. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Alright. Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths, Part 1, 2, and 3. Now, I always like to go over the pros of this movie, the things that I enjoy regarding these movies before I get into any of the bad. And rightfully so, this movie does get a lot of ridicule because, as I mentioned before, this story in the comics is one of, if not the most important storylines we ever get, because it often ends a universe and begins a new universe. That's how the comics are able to reboot so often. So that being said, to get started with the pros, I have to mention my absolute favorite thing that this trilogy did, and that was the inclusion of Kevin Conroy. The fact that this was Kevin Conroy's last project before he tragically did pass away was really, really beautiful, and his last line being, "If I go out, I want it to be being Batman," was so amazing, so impactful. The fact that Mark Hamill also did come back as well to reprise his role as the Joker was just so beautiful. And Mark Hamill has since come out and said the only reason he did that was because Kevin Conroy was attached. He would only voice the Joker if Kevin Conroy is attached to whatever project they are doing. Which I think that's really awesome to see the connection that they had, that it does go beyond the connection between their characters. And the other thing that I really love about this moment is they went back to the old school style from Batman the Animated Series. And they didn't make them look like they did in Justice League or Justice League Unlimited or even the New Adventures of Batman. Again, I am a fan of those designs. In fact, in my opinion, my favorite version of the Joker, how he was designed, was in Justice League the Animated Series. However, the sense of nostalgia that I got seeing the classic animation, the classic style of Batman and Joker in that scene was just so amazing. It made me absolutely love every second of it. And to me, that scene alone gained this movie a couple of points. Again, it may be just nostalgia, however, I really don't care. That moment was epic. It was beautiful, and it really did at the time somewhat break the internet. Because again, I feel like a lot of comic book fans out there love Kevin Conroy, and to all of them, he is and always will be their Batman. When I read any Batman comic, Kevin Conroy is the voice that I do hear, similar to how Mark Hamill is the Joker. That being said, that is not the only good thing that this trilogy of movies does. Another thing that I really enjoy is the wide variety of characters. As I mentioned, these type of stories are usually a culmination of a universe and universes being brought together, and I really love how Batman phrases it, that this is essentially a superhero think tank, because we have Batman, we have Mr. Terrific, we have Martian Manhunter, we have two versions of Superman, we have Dr. Light, and so many other characters, all with one goal, and that is trying to figure out how to stop the Anti-Monitor. And it's not necessarily them just throwing a bunch of brute force at the Anti-Monitor. No, as Batman said, this is essentially a super think tank, we have the smartest people across the multiverse here to try to determine how to take down this multiversal level threat. And I really like that aspect. That being said, speaking of inclusion of characters, the other thing that I really enjoy about this series of movies is the inclusion and expansion of the Bat family, especially having Batman Beyond be voiced by the original person who voiced him in Batman Beyond returning and reprising his role. I think that's just really cool, seeing him on screen interact with not only Batman in his prime, who's played by Jensen Ackles, but also alongside Dick Grayson Robin and Huntress, which is absolutely amazing. As many of you may know if you follow the channel, Dick Grayson, Nightwing, Robin, he is my absolute favorite DC character. He always will be. I really enjoy him. So the fact that this project did include him in this huge multiversal level event obviously gave some bonus points. And I always love when they do anything with the Bat family. And the fact that they had the Bat family on their own, fighting their own battle on a different separate planet, was really cool. And then at one point, they all ended up fighting against Batman, the Tomorrowverse universe's Batman. That was really cool because they did start to come under some sort of mind control from the different phantoms they were already battling. So we got to see Batman versus Batman Beyond versus Robin and versus Huntress, which was really awesome. That being said, one of the other things that I really enjoy is that in this universe, the Huntress was actually the daughter of Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle, and in their universe, they lost Batman. So them reuniting with Jensen Ackles' version of Batman was really heartfelt, especially because in his universe, he didn't take Dick Grayson in. He actually dropped him off out of foster care. And he alluded to that in one of the other projects. We get to see the really interesting dynamic between how he deals with seeing what would have became of Dick Grayson, and he even says it seems kind of immature to bring a child into that. But that goes deeper into why Batman really does it, and to me, my favorite explanation is that he wants Dick Grayson to work through those emotions so that he can have some sort of childhood, so that he doesn't grow up to be just like him. He doesn't want Dick Grayson to be the next Batman because he knows how lonely and miserable that life really is. And I really love any time a universe or a movie expands on that idea. That being said, one of the other things that I really enjoy about this movie, obviously the inclusion of Constantine was cool. He's a really interesting character. However, I really love how they make Darkseid such a pillar and staple character, not only in this universe, but every single universe. And they explain that because Darkseid wasn't there, that's what led the Anti-Monitor to appear. Because Darkseid is a character that has to exist. He is a pillar character and needs to be there. Otherwise, the universe will be out of balance. And that's a dynamic and an idea that I really enjoy. That being said, that is pretty much all I have for the positives on this movie. And now I'm going to get into the negatives, some of the things that I just really didn't like. So first and foremost, I am going to mention once again the inclusion of Kevin Conroy. However, that being said, I'm not saying his inclusion was bad. I'm saying his lack of inclusion was bad. We got probably about 2.5 minutes of him in the entire trilogy. And to me, that was absolutely criminal. And I'm not saying you should have made him the main character of the trilogy or in every single movie, but to me, I feel like that third film, you should have had him in it a significant amount of time, especially because that ended up being his last project. Again, now we have hindsight. So if that indeed was meant to be his last project, which it ended up being, it would have been really amazing to see him play a much bigger role. Maybe he ended up being a pillar type character, a pillar version of Batman that for some reason they did need to help save the multiverse. Again, I'm not saying he needed to be in the entire movie or in all 3 movies, but maybe after that scene where he defeats the Joker, or maybe even before that, and you still have that interaction with the Joker, because I do really enjoy that, maybe you have the other heroes going to him, finding him, and seeking him out, and saying something along the lines of, hey, we really need a legendary hero, and we were pointed to you, the Batman, the prime Batman, the best Batman. I feel like if something like that was included, even if you only expand his runtime in the movie, from 2.5 minutes to, let's say, 11-12 minutes, I think fans would have really loved that. And it would have been an even better send-off for the legend that was Kevin Conroy. Again, I may be biased because he is my Batman and I just want to see him in absolutely everything possible, especially up to and leading to his tragic passing. That being said, I do still enjoy the fact that he was in it at all, but I wish he could have been a bigger, more integral character to the story. Now, that being said, some of the other issues that I do have with this trilogy of movies is the lack of continuity and the messiness of the movies. They feel out of order. Barry Allen dies in the first movie, but then is shown in flashbacks in the third movie. Again, to me, Barry Allen is a very integral part of this trilogy, of this story, in the comics especially. And the fact that you kill him off when he's just an old man in the first one, I really didn't like. And it led to a lot of confusion. I talked to a lot of people who aren't heavy comic book fans, but they just enjoy the animated projects or live action projects, and they found it very confusing to try to follow the storylines in this movie. And I definitely can understand that, because me, I'm a huge comic book nerd, and I even found it convoluted at times. And it just felt like there wasn't one through line storyline. It felt like they kept jumping in a bunch of different directions. And I wish it just had a little bit better direction and was a little less messy. I feel like if you had a more concise story, it would have been way better and way more enjoyable for a lot of the fans out there. That being said, speaking of the comics, one of the other things that I really do not like about this trilogy of movies is how they deviate from the comics. And again, I do know that there are going to be nuances and certain things are going to be different when you go from comics to TV shows or comics to movies. I get that. However, to me, there are certain key points that you realistically should not change. One of which being Supergirl and her fate. In the comics, she does die attempting to defeat or at least hold back the Anti-Monitor. That is an epic moment, and they just totally changed that in this series. And I don't like that. I like having the emotion of certain characters meeting their end. And to me, Supergirl, it would have been really fitting. A lot of the characters grew really close to her by that point, and it would have been really felt. And that being said, one of the other characters, Barry Allen, to me, should have died in a very different way. He normally in the comics dies defeating or, again, attempting to defeat the Anti-Monitor. However, in this, he doesn't even get to directly interact with the Anti-Monitor. So it makes his death feel really lackluster and almost have no weight to it, because not really anyone is there when it's happening. So that's a real shame, because these are two characters that their deaths are supposed to mark significant moments for this storyline, but instead we're left wanting a different ending for them. It's just a really big shame that they did decide to deviate in this way. And maybe you could have had Kara, Supergirl, survive this interaction, but still have Barry die in the way he does in the comics, in a much more epic way, and actually battling against the Anti-Monitor, not just on a planet with Iris on that cosmic treadmill as an old man. To me, I felt really cheated seeing that moment, especially because when we got it on the CW, obviously we got all that build-up to only be let down and it wasn't our Barry. So this trilogy may suffer from having way higher expectations because of letdowns of past storylines. Is that fair? Maybe not. However, when you're dealing with a comic storyline this important and this iconic, that's the type of waters that you're going to have to tread into, and you can't deviate from those big moments. To me, that's always been my least favorite aspect from this movie. Now again, some of my other issues with this movie aren't necessarily tied to the movie itself, but more so with this universe. I'm not a fan of this universe's animation style. I just feel like compared to the New 52 style, it just seems lazy. It doesn't seem as vibrant. And I do get they were trying to go with a more dull sense, a more comic booky look. However, I just personally am not a fan of it. That being said, that doesn't make me take off a ton of points for this movie. However, with the other deviations from the important plot points from the comics to this movie, I'm going to start to critique way more, because it makes me notice way more things that I don't like about this movie. That being said, one of my other issues is just the lack of buildup to this. Again, we only got, I believe it was 11 or 12 films in the Tomorrowverse, and a lot of it felt rushed. We never really got a really good team up movie between the Justice League. We got the Justice League War World, which was essentially Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman in their own little realities trapped by Mongol at one point. They weren't even together for the majority of the movie. They were all in their separate little universes in their mind. And yes, we do get a little interaction between Superman and Batman. We get a little interaction between Flash and Superman in the Flash movie. However, that being said, that's not enough, in my opinion. The New 52 universe gave us so much more. It gave us so much more buildup before they started doing crazy things, before they started killing off huge characters. Whereas in this universe, we only saw the Flash appear in, what, 2 projects before he inevitably died? That just loses a lot of fans, and it loses a lot of the gravity that you would have had if you made us grow even more close to these characters in a much larger scale and over a longer period of time of movies. Again, I know a lot of that can't be helped because the different studios interfere or only approve a certain number of movies, but still, if that's the case, don't even attempt this type of movie. And if you do it in a different universe. Do it maybe based on the New 52 universe after Barry Allen runs away at the end of Apocalypse War. Again, that's just my opinion. That's what I think. But that is why, to me, this movie, if I had to go overrated or overhated, me personally, I'm putting overrated. I was not a huge fan of this trilogy. And yes, there are amazing moments and awesome team-ups. However, to me, the bad does outweigh the good, especially because the bad is such a deviation from the comics and huge plot points in the comics. But what do all of you think? Do you think this movie is overrated? Or would you say that I'm hating a little bit too much and it's more so overhated? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.